I've got three examples here where we are using either multiplication or division to be able to simplify the equation, and we solve the equation for one variable. We try to isolate the variable, get it on one side by itself. In order to do that, we need to be able to get rid of all of the stuff that's on the same side of the equal sign as the variable. All the numbers, all of the stuff needs to go away in order to get it to equal one number on the other side. Okay, so let's take this first example right here. First example is negative n divided by 5, all right? And so what I end up, I'm going to write this bigger. I don't like how small that is. Negative n here, I'm going to make this just a little bigger too. Okay, negative n divided by 5 equals negative 3. Okay, my two sides of the equation that I'm talking about look just like this. This is kind of separated by two sides. There's an equal in the middle right there. And so I want to get rid of this dividing by 5. Okay, so the opposite of dividing by 5 is to multiply by 5. And sometimes what we do is we can put parentheses around this whole side. And I notice there's a negative here too. So if I were to multiply by a negative 5 on both sides, what that ends up doing is it would be a negative times a negative makes it positive. And then it actually allows that 5 in the bottom to go away. All right. Because essentially what you're doing is you're taking like 1/5 and multiplying it by 5. And that's the same as 5 over 1. And what ends up happening is you get 5 divided by 5 is how this would work out. And essentially this equals 1. And by allowing it to equal 1, it will cancel out. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do. If I multiply by negative 5 on this side, then I need to also do it on this side over here. So negative 5, multiply. Okay, so these cross out right like this, including the negative up there. And what I end up with is n on one side by itself, n, and then equals. And notice I drop my equal sign straight down right underneath of the other equal sign. And it's a negative times a negative is a positive, and 3 times 5 is 15. So my final answer is, and the solution to this, one way that we say that is the solution is 15. That's the only number that makes this particular statement true, this equation true. Okay, so I do have to check it. So I'm double checking at the end. And I rewrite my original. Here's my original. Negative n divided by 5 equals negative 3. Okay, and I'm going to plug in this value right here. Needs to go into the n location. Well, it's positive 15. And so it will make it a negative. And so this actually turns into negative 15 divided by 5 equals negative 3. And yes, it works out, right? This actually ends up being negative 3 equals negative 3. And yes, it checks out. All right. So if it checks out, then you know you did it correctly. And it says right here in the directions, check your answer. So I want you to make sure to get in the habit of checking your answer. All right, we'll separate this out a little bit. You notice that this next example looks kind of weird. It's got a pi, but remember that like pi is not a whole lot different than having a number out front like 3.14. Obviously, it goes larger, like more decimals than 3.14, but I'm just emphasizing that it's just a number. All right, so and so you can do the same thing on both sides. Notice I have a pi here and a pi here. So what I can actually do is I can actually simplify it by dividing both sides by pi. Divide by pi and divide by pi, which is kind of weird because it's a goofy symbol, right? But it's the same as dividing by 3.14 and divide by 3.14 on both sides. And you end up with x left over on one side by itself because these cross out because something divided by itself turns into 1, right? Just like over here, something divided by itself turns into 1. And so it leaves the x behind, while over here, pi divided by pi also cancels out, which is sort of like 3.14 divided by 3.14. And they just go away. They just cancel, which is kind of nice. It cancels on both sides. All right. And it equals -2. And that's actually your final answer because we isolated the variable. The variable is all by itself on one side. All right, check your answer. So finally, we have to check it at the end. The original was pi multiplied by x equals -2 pi. Okay, so what we end up doing is we take pi multiplied by, which is 3.14 rounded, multiplied by -2, plug it in there, -2 equals -2 pi, right? And so we could do the arithmetic out, and you'd get like -6.28 rounded, because I would take my 3.14 and I'd multiply by 2, -2, and it would equal the same thing over here, -6.28. All right, and it would check out. Yes, this one does check out. Nicely done. All right, let's do last problem. Right here, we have some decimals. In between here, there is multiplication. So if I was to write it with our explicit multiplication, it would have multiply by z, right? Often we put a little mark on z like that just to emphasize that it's not a 2, and equals 5.2, right? Like that. All right. So if this is multiplication in between here, then we have to do the opposite. In order to undo it and get rid of it on one side so that z is by itself, we need to divide by 1.3. All right. So the opposite of multiplying by 1.3 is dividing. So we divide by 1.3, right, like that. And whatever I do to one side must do to the other side of the equal sign, right? So right here, I can cross these out. And what does z equal? Well, I can rewrite it. Z equals whatever that is, 5.2 divided by 1.3. 2 divided by 1.3, and we get 4. All right, nice. And so it would be a straight up 4 as our final answer on this one. All done, right? No, not yet. Remember, the instructions up there say check your answer. Okay, so we just get in the habit of doing that right at the end. And I'm going to check my work, check my answer. And so it would be something like plugging 4 where z is in the original. So here's 1.3, z equals 5.2. Okay, check your work by plugging that in there. So 1.3 multiplied by 4 equals 5.2, and yes, it does. If I did the multiplication on that, I would get 5.2 equals 5.2, right, like that. So yes, it checks out. So I go, yep, checks out, which means we did the arithmetic correctly. And my final answer, the only number that satisfies this equation or is a solution to it, is 4 for z. All right. There's 3 individual examples here. And so little interesting, but that concludes our examples.